Welcome to the Vander-Ende Onderdonk House Greater Ridgewood Historical Society's first July 4th Declaration of Independence reading event. Okay, everybody. Welcome to the Vander-Ende Onderdonk House Greater Ridgewood Historical Society's first July 4th Declaration of Independence reading event. My name is Charles Sanchez. I'm the historian here at the house, and I'm also a descendant of a Declaration of Independence signer. His name is Oliver Wolcott from Connecticut. He's also a brigadier and major general of the Connecticut militia. He was assigned his post by Governor Jonathan Trumbull of Connecticut. But before I start reading the Declaration of Independence, I'd like to talk to you guys about what you know about the Declaration of Independence and the Continental Congresses that were here. Does anybody here know anything about the Continental Congress? So,
she knows everything.
Oh, you know. Well, we know the Second Continental Congress was the one that signed the Declaration of Independence. Does anybody here know about anything about the First Continental Congress? George Washington was a member of the First Continental Congress. Do you know what their job was? What were they doing? You don't know. Okay. So what they were designed, what they were organized to do was they were organized to redress the grievances that the 13 colonies had with Great Britain. The only other time that they had organized before that was in 1765 during the Stamp Act crisis. There was a Stamp Act Congress where they didn't want their paper to be stamped and pay extra money just because they were using paper, depending on what profession you were in. Usually it was the lawyer profession. Playing cards had stamps on them, but that was the first time they organized themselves in such a fashion. So here we go again. In 1775, they stuck their grievances with Great Britain. The colonies had differences, and they organized themselves again during the First Continental Congress. It was about September 1775, and they had decided if King George III wasn't going to redress their grievances, they would create a Second Continental Congress. Now, what you guys need to know is that as they were creating these Continental Congresses, they weren't supposed to declare independence. Declaring independence was actually a very sudden thing that had happened. Now, does anybody here recognize an American Revolutionary War flag in front of me? Does anyone know which one was the first one? The first Revolutionary War flag. Does anybody see it? Can you point to it?
This one.
Well, hold on a second. So I have two people pointing to the Betsy Ross flag, and I have somebody else pointing to this one. Now, this one is actually the first flag of the Revolutionary War. What's this flag called?
Something with bars?
No, this is called the Grand Union flag.
Okay.
Now, the Grand Union flag, now what do you see in this flag? You see, well, let's talk about the bars. So, what do these bars represent?
13 colonies.
13 colonies. Now, what does this represent?
Great Britain.
Okay. Now, it does represent, this was called the King's Colors. Now, it's not the Union Jack that we see today, because what's missing in here, all the crosses and bars are red and white. Here you see an empty space here. This cross represents the cross of St. Patrick. What you're looking at is the cross of St. George, the cross of St. Andrew, cross of St. George is Britain, cross of St. Andrew is Scotland, but the cross of St. Patrick is Ireland. And Ireland Britain hadn't conquered Ireland yet in this flag. So now, when you see the red in here, now Ireland is part of the British Isles, part of the British Empire. Now, this flag was flown on January 1st, 1776. Washington was in Boston with the Continental Army, and that's when they first got their name. Continental Army was in January 1st. When the British saw this flag being flown, they thought we were surrendering, because it had their flag inside of ours. So they naturally thought that we were giving up, but we weren't. what this flag was to symbolize, this is called the Grand Union flag, was that it was our desire to reconcile, not declare independence. That came way later. Well, it didn't come way later, but it came 6 months later. But just so you guys know, when we think about independence, we think it was an immediate, quick thing. It was actually a long and arduous process. And actually, New York was one of the last colonies to sign on to the Declaration of Independence. New York was London Junior, and that meant that everybody here that was doing business usually had close ties to Great Britain. So for them to declare independence would mean cutting all those ties and relationships. And that was not something that they really wanted to do. But I'm going to tell you guys more about it after I read the Declaration. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the Declaration, the call for independence didn't happen a month earlier on June 7, 1776. Richard Henry Lee, he was one of the delegates to the Continental Congress from Virginia. He put forth a resolution. Now, I want you to hear these resolutions carefully because you're going to hear them again at the end of the Declaration. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. I'm going to stop right there because I want to talk about a plan of confederation. They weren't just declaring independence. Confederation was a form of government. There was a constitutional convention that we had in the late 1780s. There was a president before George Washington that nobody knew. This was a government formed on what was called the Articles of Confederation. And the reason why it was too weak. The president was too weak, the Congress was too weak, and that's why there had to be a constitutional convention to fix what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation. So that's what was happening on July 4th, in addition to declaring independence, was forming a half-assed form of government, pretty much. Okay. Now, this declaration, once this resolution went forth, what also happened was that everything in Congress had to stop. More than half the delegates to the Continental Congress did not have instructions to declare independence. They had to go back to their home states and get permission to do this. Imagine if our Congress people today had that much thought about what we think when something as important comes and they come back home and discuss it with us and get permission from us to go do something. I mean, they just go do it. And they come tell us later and they spin us why they did it, why it's good for us, and if you got a problem with it. These guys didn't think like that. They were very conscientious and they were very constituent-minded. There was no media, there was no spinning. You had to talk to them face to face all the time. So BSing anybody was not an option because it's easy to BS somebody through the media, but when you're constantly looking at somebody back then. And you also have to understand too that this is a pre-literate society where only 1 in 12 reads. So the spoken word is more important than the written word. And most people can't read, they're paying attention to what you're saying more than what's being written down. So, just to give you an idea. So while the delegates that need permission are going home to their colonies to get permission, there's a committee that gets created on June 11th. The Second Continental Congress creates this Declaration Committee, and they select Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to draft this Declaration of Independence. John Adams, knowing Jefferson's prowess with a pen, he urges him to be the one to create these drafts. Now, Jefferson already has a residence inside Philadelphia, but to conduct his tasks, he goes elsewhere to write the drafts. Finding his lodgings in the heart of Philadelphia uncomfortable.
Did you donate your money?
That's a bird bid. That's a bird bid he's wearing to keep the mess off of him when he's killing birds. Looks like a mouse pad. Finding his lodgings in the heart of Philadelphia uncomfortable, he removes to the rooms of Jacob Graff. Graff was a well-known bricklayer who had built his house on the outskirts of town a year before Jefferson arrived. Jefferson had to pay a little extra for the rooms as they came furnished. The Graffs lived in the house while Jefferson undertook his task. So situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and a stable across the street, the house provided Jefferson with the space and distance from the city he needed for his task. A fair copy, carefully revised by Adams and Franklin before being given to Congress for review on June 28th. Okay, I'm about to read to you the Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient force. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new gods for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to attend to the world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governments to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodations of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants like him. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolution, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to the laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount of payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature. He is affected to render the military independence of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. For abolishing the free system of English laws in the neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Our prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the tie of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too must have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemy in war and peace friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appeal to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions due in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So there you have it. Richard Henry Lee's the last paragraph is the last paragraph. Finishes off the Declaration of Independence with a little more adjustments to it. Now, the Declaration of Independence, I said, was brought here on July 9th and was ratified the last. And at 6 p.m. on July 9th, George Washington had it read to the Continental Army in Lower Manhattan at the Commons. That's where City Hall is today. Now, after the Declaration of Independence was read to his troops and the citizens that were in attendance, the group went down Broadway to where Bowling Green is. Has anybody been down to Bowling Green where the Bull is? Okay. Bowling Green is surrounded by a fence today that's from 1770. The original fence was torn down, the original wooden fence was torn down on November 1st, 1765 during the Stamp Act riots. But after that was resolved, New York, in their appreciations to King George III ending that nonsense, replaced the fence and put a statue of him there. It's 2 tons of lead, gilded in gold, and King George III was in the Roman form of Marcus Aurelius. Now, the group came down Broadway and they tore down that statue, and they broke it up into little pieces, and it was taken to my family's farm, and it was turned into 43,000 musket balls. Now, the problem is that my family, the Woolcott family lived in Litchfield, Connecticut, and if you've been in that part of Connecticut, you can go 3 miles up the hill and 3 miles down the hill. They did the math and found out half the statue never made it because it was too damn heavy for the 2 ox carts that were taking it. So they were just heaving the statue, in addition to whipping these poor animals trying to get it there, because the metal was very well needed. So last thing they wanted to do was to heave this stuff off to the side, but that was the only way to get it there. And my family kept a detailed ledger of it. The Litchfield Historical Society has the ledger that my family kept because they knew that they were making history with this statue. And little pieces of it have been found. I check up on my family my family's history every once a year. And 10 years ago, I did it around Thanksgiving and found out that the Litchfield Historical Society was having an exhibit called His Melting Majesty. So I went there with my brother and sister, and we saw all the little pieces that they had, all the historical societies or whoever owned it privately had it together. I consider that statue a piece of an heirloom. Hopefully I'll get a little piece of it one day, but that's a real cool part that I had found out as I was researching my family Revolutionary War groups while I was working at my first museum, the Old Stone House in Brooklyn, which is a Revolutionary War museum, so it was really cool finding out like that then. So that's pretty much it.